Hey there. I recognize there are only a few days left in Women's History Month, but I am still celebrating women. And this month I got a chance to speak to Rachel Bensimon, who is the Vice President of State Policy and Advocacy at Planned Parenthood of America, Planned Parenthood Action Fund. I know I was just reading that, not so subtly. There's a lot. So she's not here on behalf of Planned Parenthood. She's just a dear friend. And when I was thinking about people I wanted to speak to, she popped to mind just because she is such a fighter for women's rights, gender equality, and human rights in general. She's badass. So I hope you enjoy her as much as I do. Thanks.
My name is Rachel Sussman Bensimon. I work for Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund. I'm not here on behalf of the organization, but my experience over the past 15 years has kind of led me deep into gender politics, and frankly, what it means to get to live your life free from control. And what are all the systems and structures in place that make it hard for people to do that? People of all gender identities. With Build Up Boys, one of the most powerful things I think you're doing is really honing in on how misogyny, patriarchy, white supremacy doesn't just impact those it's targeted at. It is truly toxic for all of us.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I don't think you've had a chance to see either of these films, but I recently saw Turning Red, which, as they describe, is defiantly Asian and defiantly female, which I love. And I also saw a Norwegian film called The Worst Person in the World. And they both deal with menstruation in such a way that is so in your face and owning it and eliminating and stripping shame from it. There's a scene in the Norwegian film where the main character, she does shrooms and she's high and she takes out her bloody tampon and throws it at someone and then takes her blood and puts it underneath her eyes like war paint. Having two boys, I just instinctually, without forget the movies that I saw, just kind of knew I want them to know that I got my period every month, and I want them to know I use tampons, and I want to explain to them, and they've seen my tampons and we talk about it and we talk about what it means. And I want my boys part of the conversation about my body and to normalize it. I think that's what these films are doing. And given you have been in the women's rights, how would you describe it? Not because you're not here to speak for Planned Parenthood, but just in this space, what would you call this space?
Well, I mean, I think the space is connected more broadly to how, particularly in this country, but other countries as well, we think of sex, we think of what is kind of gender normative and what we expect of people, specifically, young girls, and then in turn, young boys and how they respond to that. We tend to see a kind of a shame and a stigma around all sorts of development, particularly for young girls. And so that has to do with menstruation, breast development, and even more broadly, how young girls are meant to feel shame around these things, and that stigma kind of perpetuates and stays with you, right? And that in fact, instead of it being a celebration, it is kind of seen as something to keep secret, to be embarrassed by, and that is toxic. Yes. For all of us. Yeah. And I think what it does is it denies all of us humanity. I mean, if your body is actually doing this and it's the most normal and natural thing
ever, yes,
ever, how harmful is that you can't even talk about it? It's almost bizarre, right? So women who can get their period have been having them forever, and it is still something that so many people feel shame about. It's something that, you know, if you don't have a pad or a tampon at school, you have to like quietly go to the nurse or hope you have a quarter to maybe use those machines. Like, I don't even know if those
I don't know if they exist anymore, right?
I don't either. But you know, it is really, it's powerful to see representation, like in the movies you're talking about, because that is one of the main ways you break down stigma, is to talk about it. And so I love the example of you talking to your boys about it, because like that is truly how you shift culture. And that's what we're talking about. You know, systems and structures are not just laws and policies. They're the culture we live in, which, you know, I kind of think of it as like, it's like the water we're all swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so oppressive that I don't even think we all realize it. And so I think the more we can talk about it, that is like on an individual level, using your power and your voice to shift culture. Part of destigmatizing these things is having these conversations in an age appropriate way, but also doing it, you know, before they're in that moment. I like to, with my kids, you know, have these types of conversations, have conversations about racism, anti-Semitism, not only when we're reading a book about the thing, but
Right.
kind of just, you know, naming it and noting it kind of pretty liberally, to kind of get them to develop observations when, you know, something is off or something is not right, or someone's making me feel bad, or I know that that's wrong. Because if you're only having conversations in the context of, we're going to have this big moment around what it means when girls get their period, it kind of can add to some of the stigmatization. So that's why I love this idea with this movie, or you talking to your kids about your own experience. When it's their mom, when it's their sister, it breaks down walls. And so I think it's important. And if we were all kind of doing it, we would see culture shift a lot faster. There is, you know, a lot of work to do culturally around how stigma and shame are used to keep people in their place, and how they are used to continue to grow power for those who are in charge and want to control the culture. And so to
Tell me
me,
more about that. Like, just unpack that, because that's like so much. Because that's exactly right.
On an individual level, talking to your kids, like that is, you know, and trying to shift the culture that way, that is like an individual step in kind of revolution and upending what I would say are just intensely oppressive systems that many of us live in, that at some level we accept because it's just everywhere. And so to me, the only way we kind of significantly shift that is, you know, some of it happens generationally.
Yes.
And, you know, working with our children so that they can kind of exist in a different world. It requires changing laws and policies. It requires changing who is in power. You know, I think there is not enough of a robust conversation with children and in general about who gets to make decisions about our lives, who's in power, who's in control, why is it working this way? And, you know, that's a little different than constantly, you know, your kid won't follow any rules or won't do homework.
Totally.
Right? Although it's been used against me.
Right.
But I think questioning who's in power and questioning authority is like a necessary skill right now, because the power structures that exist create and use stigma, shame, laws and policies, television, news networks to all try to keep us in our place. To me, these power structures that force us to kind of create and perpetuate these norms are toxic, and they're directly related to the type of work that you're doing, because it is like the systems and structures and those in power that perpetuate the environment that make it, you know, frankly dangerous for us to raise our girls and boys in a healthy way, emotionally, for sure. The idea of, you know, why women and girls are here on earth, right? To procreate, to be caregivers. You have that kind of combination with, you know, for the most part, like white men in power who have a vested interest in keeping those structures, the structure of gender norms in place. It is going to follow suit that our laws and policies and our culture kind of support that, because those in power, those who are getting to make a lot of these decisions, are kind of perpetuating the same systems and want to, because they benefit from, perpetuate the same exact systems.
Okay, can you explain to me, how do they benefit from them? Because when I look at all the stats, I mean, and again, white men different than black men, different than Asian men, like, you know, masculinity and power act out differently in all different cultures. But like, what I don't understand is when you look at the stats, not just of like violence, but self-harm, that the stats are that men are less likely to seek mental health help, less likely to go on medication, more likely to die from suicide. And so it's like, to what end? Like, what are they? What's the benefit? Like, have you seen or witnessed, or do you understand or have some sense of nuanced understanding of what the benefit is? Because I feel like, as you keep saying the word toxic, and I think that's why it's called toxic masculinity, is that it's hurting everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, having power based on your own identity and who you are, and feeling like you were born with that innate power, there is kind of proof over and over and over again that people would rather harm their own self-interests than give up that perceived structural and cultural power. I mean, history is riddled with this, right? During the civil rights movement, when they started integrating the pools, all white communities like cemented over their pools rather than integrate. Right? So they were like, we'd rather give up our pool than integrate. And that, I mean, there are examples like that everywhere. And so that is what is so corrosive about this, and why this work requires a power analysis, and what it means for people to feel as if they have cultural power within a structure, and that they are willing to functionally, to your point, die for it, because it is their status within society. And so that is why, you know, in terms of like working with kids, disrupting what is normative, who has power over who, reminding children who do have privilege within society to constantly be analyzing how they are situating themselves, because while on an individual level, your child may not be causing harm, the only way this culture really shifts is some of these power dynamics and how they exist shift. For me, so sometimes, you know, at family dinner, right? Or if we're having a holiday with the rest of the family, I will notice, and it's not because anybody is requiring it, but I will notice at the end of the meal, most of the women get up and start clearing the table. And so, whether my family likes it or not, I publicly name it, because I want.
You're like, everybody.
Then everybody's like, okay. But I mostly do it for the kids, because I need to, within our family structure, call it out, because it is at some level somewhat innocuous, right? It's like, but not. Because that is what creates the water that, you know, we all swim in. And so to me, that is like a good example of, on a personal level, disrupting some of the power structures, because one, they're seeing their mom, a woman, call it out.
Yes.
There's nothing more powerful than that. You ask my kids, like, who's the most powerful person you know? Is this lady. right? Because you have to be willing to name it, and to kind of name their privilege, right, in that structure. So I didn't direct that at Sam, my son. Like, I wanted my daughter to hear it just as much.
Yes.
but it was like the way they're going to hear that and experience that over time will be different, because in a lot of those scenarios, Sam would ultimately be the beneficiary, because 10, 15 years from now, he'd be hanging with the boys sitting at the table, and maybe Maya would feel like she needed to clear the table. And so, I do a few other things. Like sometimes in those situations, I just don't do it. So I'll stay at the table. I'm not clearing. I have a healthy and happy marriage, and it's pretty egalitarian, although I do at moments feel like I take on a lot of the caregiving, but like, I don't really do the laundry or wash the dishes that much.
Amazing.
Because well, one, maybe I don't want to, but I do plenty of other things, right?
Like, don't get me wrong. Like,
yeah, like it's not like, I'm, out getting mani-pedis all day. Like I have plenty on my plate, but I just feel like, yeah, like, my husband, like, Liron is gonna do that, and you're all gonna bear witness to that. And 20 years from now, like it is normative behavior of somehow men not doing dishes, like that just wouldn't be in your repertoire, because that is not how you grew up. So, doing some of these things consciously and then naming them, I think is helpful. I think at some level, I'm not a childhood, expert, but I do think sometimes doing things like that, rather than turning everything into a lesson.
yes.
So in that moment, I then don't necessarily say like, let's talk about why I did that.
Calling out seems more like a teaching moment. It's like a cognitive kind of pause, and to be like, wait, like I'm going to challenge this notion or idea. So that does feel like a teaching moment. Whereas just having a household where you don't do the laundry or you don't do the dishes, that feels more like modeling.
I think in order to shift the culture, even in your own household, you need to both model and display those behaviors and create some like cognitive markers so your children start to look at those moments with a critical eye. And it's really ultimately what it's doing is like disrupting and calling out something that feels so normal and just the way it is. But the way it's that way is because of like the systems and structures we live in and who is in power and who's trying to hold on to it. And so like, sitting your kid down and having that conversation might be a little like, ooh,
Need a little too much, right?
A little too much. But raising them to kind of question and know when those things are happening ultimately means, hopefully you're raising kids who kind of disrupt those power structures. And again, I just think we don't, it's really interesting to me how much we don't talk about power and who has it, because it has such an impact over all of our lives in such profound ways. And, so for me, one of the things I learned in the work that I do pretty quickly is you could have all the facts in the world, right? And if you have no power, I mean, you can argue with yourself. You and I can talk about it and be like, yes, that's the way it's gotta be. And that's why I became obsessed with having power, because to me, it is how you functionally change things. And so building power, building movements, raising children and being in communities that hold those in power with a critical eye and who look at systems and structures with that lens is, to me, it should be like curriculum. Because I just think otherwise we all go through the motions of living within these systems that are put on us that ultimately are like cages on our identity, cages and attempts to kind of control who we are and what we can do and what we can be, and how we want to live our lives. Power in general is neutral. It's not necessarily bad or good. When it is used to subjugate people, when it is used over people, when it is used to dominate and to harm people, it is obviously bad. But it is not, it doesn't have to inherently be bad. I mean, some of the biggest movements in our, country, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, broadly the reproductive rights and reproductive justice movement, are filled with examples of shared power. It doesn't mean that it's always perfect and that there's not struggles, but in general, if a movement wants to change laws and policies and they want to shift culture, it is almost always done more effectively if you are actually creating a large coalition of people coming together and sharing power and fighting broadly for some sort of change. I fundamentally believe that oftentimes when we center those most in need or most in harm from our current power structures, when we do the work that way, we all benefit so much more than if kind of just different constituencies are focused in their own space. So I just think like the shift that we want to see in the world and in the country only happens through shared power and coalition building and really understanding how the harm perpetuated on different communities always has an intersectional aspect. People should not be expected to kind of choose one part of themselves over another in terms of the communities they identify with and who has power. People are experiencing that world, the world collectively. And so I think our movements in general, the ones that are built really intersectionally and that center those most in need and those most harmed, yield the most promise to seek the change we actually want.